Okay, so it is 7 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and get it started. And what I want to do is I want to go over the slides for the endocrine system. And essentially, the slides are going to go through the endocrine system glands that we cover in the chapter. And we'll talk about the hormones that each of the glands secretes and the functions, target organs, and abnormal conditions when it applies of each of the hormones. So we start with what we call the master gland, which is the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is also called the hypophysis. Hypo means below, physis means to grow. So the reason why it's called the hypophysis is because this gland grows below the hypothalamus. So if you notice, here's the hypothalamus, this area right there, which is part of the diencephalon in the brain, and the pituitary is connected to the hypothalamus via a little stalk called the infundibulum. So this is called the hypophysis because it's growing below the hypothalamus. Okay, now the pituitary gland is actually two glands, not one. The anterior pituitary is a true gland as it is made of glandular tissue, epithelial tissue. So you see cells here, which are the hormone secreting cells. This gland actually comes about through an upgrowth of the soft palate during development. Notice that the anterior pituitary does not have a direct connection to the hypothalamus. The posterior pituitary, on the other hand, is made of nervous tissue. So it is also called the neurohypophysis. It is continuous to the hypothalamus, and it is made of the axons or hypothalamic hormones that travel through the infundibulum and release their hormones into blood vessels of the hypothalamus to be distributed throughout the body. So the posterior pituitary is also called the neurohypophysis because it's made of nervous tissue. The hormones are secreted by a neuron. So the hormones made by the posterior pituitary are neurohormones, meaning hormones secreted by a neuron. On the other hand, the anterior pituitary is also called the adenohypophysis, and this is a true gland secreting real hormones. So we're going to look at the posterior pituitary first, and you can see how the posterior pituitary secretes the hormones of these neurons, which are located in the hypothalamus and whose axons travel all the way down the infundibulum to the posterior pituitary, and they secrete the hormone into the blood vessels of the posterior pituitary. From there, the hormones are going to travel in the blood vessel to the target tissue. So the posterior pituitary hormones are made in the hypothalamus, but are secreted in the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary secretes two hormones, oxytocin and ADH. ADH is a very, very, very important hormone. We're going to talk about ADH the entire semester. ADH stands for antidiuretic hormone. Another name for ADH is vasopressin. The target organ, the main target organ of ADH are the kidney tubules, because the effects of ADH are water retention inside the kidney tubules. So now kidneys are going to put back into blood the water that has been filtered from blood. So instead of urinating that water, the kidneys are going to put it back into the blood, which means the volume of urine will decrease. On the other hand, the volume of blood will increase. High blood volume equals a higher blood pressure. because blood pressure is created by molecules traveling inside blood vessels. As these molecules bumped against each other and against the walls of the blood vessel, pressure is created. So the more molecules, the more blood volume, the more blood pressure. So antidiuretic hormone is a hormone that increases blood pressure. So it really has two effects. It decreases urine, conserves water, in the process puts the water back into the blood, increasing blood pressure. When high quantities of ADH are secreted, which means that we are severely dehydrated or we are losing fluids through a wound, for example, or some form of bleeding, ADH under high quantities also constricts blood vessels. Constriction of blood vessels, and this should read constriction of peripheral blood vessels. This would be the blood vessels of the skin, the kidneys, the GI tract, reproductive organs, so that blood is shunted towards the center of the body, the heart, lungs, skeletal muscle, brain. By doing so, by constricting blood vessels and moving blood towards the center of the body, we're also increasing blood pressure because we're increasing blood volume in large blood vessels. So to review, ADH, the functions of ADH is twofold: to retain water which in turn increases blood pressure. So if this is the result of ADH secretion, this is the effect of ADH secretion, that means that the body is going to secrete ADH when it needs these effects to happen, which means when the body is dehydrated and it needs to conserve water. Now we're going to have water retention, and I should say, when blood pressure is low and blood pressure needs to be increased. So ADH is secreted in response to small changes in blood osmolarity as it occurs as we are dehydrated, and more importantly, large changes in blood pressure. So when our blood pressure falls significantly. Okay. So when we have low blood volume, which would translate into low blood pressure, ADH secreted. ADH forces the kidneys to retain water. This increases blood volume. And low blood pressure activate receptors for blood pressure in the carotid and aortic bodies, which tells the neurohypophysis to secrete ADH. ADH secretion causes water retention, which increases blood volume, which increases blood pressure. One of the things you should do as you go through this chapter is to make a list of the hormones that increase blood pressure. So you can put ADH as one of the hormones that increases blood pressure. Okay, so main functions of ADH: retain water. So the kidney is the target organ. The kidneys retain water, put that water back into the blood, high blood volume, high blood pressure. So the hormone will be secreted when we have low blood pressure or when we're dehydrated. And if you have a question, just type it up and I'll be able to see it and address, and give you guys an answer. Okay. Also, there's a little figure with a a hand raised, and that also alerts me that somebody has a question. Okay, so abnormal conditions of ADH. The abnormal condition of low ADH secretion is called diabetes insipidus. Okay, so the term diabetes is a misnomer. This is not diabetes. However, it was called diabetes. It was given that name because one of the signs and symptoms is polyuria, which means lots of urination, so high urination, which occurs in diabetes. Polydipsia, meaning thirst, which also occurs in diabetes. So because some of the signs were the same signs experienced by diabetic patients, they thought that this was a form of diabetes. It is not. It has nothing to do with blood sugar. But some of the signs and symptoms are the same. Obviously, if we have low ADH, we're going to urinate a lot. We're going to have high urination. There's nothing to prevent urination, to retain water. So there is your polyuria. If we lose a lot of water through urine, we're going to be thirsty. So there's the other sign and symptom of low ADH secretion. The word insipidus means no taste, letting you know that the output of urine is essentially just water. There is no sugar there. It's a tasteless, if you will, urine. So abnormal condition of ADH secretion, diabetes insipidus, which takes place when ADH is low, and some of the signs and symptoms is thirst, because we're losing water, and excessive urination. Okay, the second hormone secreted by the posterior pituitary is oxytocin. And I'm just going to talk briefly about oxytocin. It is, again, like both of the posterior pituitary hormones, ADH and oxytocin are neurohormones because they're secreted by neurons. Its function is to stimulate the smooth muscle of the uterus for contraction during labor, and to start the milk letdown reflex. It has some other functions during sexual intercourse, making us feel, binding to other people, etc. But the only ones we need to know for test purposes is stimulation of the muscles of the uterus and the milk letdown reflex. So again, we're not going to spend too much time on oxytocin. Okay, so we have covered the two hormones secreted by the posterior pituitary. Because the posterior pituitary, or neurohypophysis, is made of neurons, the hormones are called neurohormones because they're being secreted by neurons. Now, the anterior pituitary is a different creature. First of all, this is a true gland. This is made of glandular epithelial tissue. And it secretes several hormones, which are typically put into two populations. The ones that we call tropic hormones and the ones that we call non-tropic hormones. Tropic means to turn on, which means these hormones are going to turn on other glands. We'll go over all of the four tropic hormones: TSH, ACTH, FSH, and LH. So all four hormones will turn on other glands into secreting their own hormones. Non-tropic hormones are going to affect target organs and elicit responses on those target organs. So they're not going to necessarily cause the secretion of hormones. All right, so tropic hormones, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. The target for this hormone is going to be the thyroid gland. So the thyroid gland is stimulated, so it's turned on, and it begins to secrete its hormones, T3 and T4, so thyroid hormones 3 and 4. ACTH is called adrenal for the adrenal glands, cortical for the cortex of the adrenal gland, tropic because it's going to turn on the cortex of the adrenal gland. So this hormone triggers the adrenal cortex into secreting its hormones, cortisol, aldosterone, androgens. Gonadotropic hormones are put together: FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone. We will talk more about these hormones at the end of the semester during the reproductive chapter. Today, what you have to know for now is that they are gonadotropic hormones. They stimulate or turn on the gonads, which in females are the ovaries and the testes. And when they are turned on by FSH and LH, the ovaries secrete estrogen and progesterone, and the testes will secrete testosterone. So FSH and LH turns on the gonads to secrete their own hormones. Okay. The two non-tropic hormones of the anterior pituitary are GH, growth hormone, and PRL, prolactin. We'll spend some time talking about GH. Sometimes it's called HGH for human growth hormone. I will spend a little bit of time talking about PRL or prolactin. Now, the anterior pituitary hormones are controlled. So secretion of these hormones is controlled by hormones secreted by the hypothalamus. And when you think about it, this actually makes a lot of sense, because the anterior pituitary is secreting very, very powerful hormones. And this is the anterior pituitary, the one a little bit darker. It's secreting very powerful hormones that are going to turn on other glands, or like the growth hormone, is going to affect lots of organs around the body. So they're very powerful hormones that have to be tightly controlled. So they're going to be controlled by hormones secreted in the hypothalamus. There is no direct connection between hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. There is a direct connection between posterior pituitary and hypothalamus via the infundibulum, but not between anterior and pituitary hypothalamus. So the connection between them is going to be via blood vessels. That's why the hypothalamus secrete hormones into blood. These hormones travel through what is called the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. So this is a net of blood vessels that travels from the hypothalamus to the pituitary, also called the hypophysis. A portal system is a system of blood vessels that travels between two organs. So in this case, hypothalamus and hypophysis or pituitary. So the hypothalamic hormones will be secreted by the hypothalamus into the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system, and through that system of blood vessels, the hormone will anterior pituitary, affect the anterior pituitary, and anterior pituitary will secrete whatever hormone has been stimulated into secreting. This is another depiction of the same, is showing you the hypothalamic hormones being secreted and affecting the anterior pituitary into secreting their own hormones. Now, so the target of the hypothalamic hormones are going to be the anterior pituitary. Hypothalamic hormones are neurohormones, just like the hormones of the posterior pituitary. ADH and oxytocin. All hormones secreted by neurons are called neurohormones. There are two types of hypothalamic hormones: releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones. Releasing hormones are going to have an R in their acronym. Inhibiting hormones are going to have an I in their acronym. Releasing hormones trigger the secretion or release of anterior pituitary hormones. On the other hand, inhibiting hormones are going to inhibit or prevent the release of anterior pituitary hormones. Now, this may seem confusing, and it is to some extent. if you make it simple. This is how you make it simple. If the acronym has an R in its name, you know this is a hypothalamic hormone that is going to release anterior pituitary hormones. If the acronym has an I in its name, you know this is an inhibiting hormone that is going to trigger or prevent the release of anterior pituitary hormones. So the names of these hormones are very long. In the test, I will give you the acronym and the actual words that the acronym stands for. So if we talk about GHRH, in parentheses, it will be written growth hormone releasing hormone. So the name tells you immediately what this hormone does. It causes the release of growth hormone. And because it has the R for release in its name, you know this is a hypothalamic hormone. So GHRH triggers the release of growth hormone. Thyrotropin releasing hormone causes the release of TSH. So this releases TSH, causes the anterior pituitary to release TSH. GHRH causes release of growth hormone. CRH, corticotropic releasing hormone, causes the release of ACTH. GnRH, gonadotropic releasing hormone, causes the release of FSH and LH. PRH, prolactin releasing hormone, causes the release of prolactin, PRL. So these are the releasing hormones. The anterior pituitary releases 5 hormones, and each one of them is going to have a corresponding releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. GnRH causes the release of 2 hormones, FSH and LH. Inhibiting hormones, there's only 2. Growth hormone inhibiting hormone and prolactin inhibiting hormone. Okay, so when it comes to inhibiting hormones, there's only 2 of them. The one that stops the release of growth hormone and the one that stops the release of prolactin. Okay, so hopefully this is a little better. Let's see. Okay, I don't know why I have that twice. All right, so let's move on to, we're going to go over the anterior pituitary hormones, and we're going to start with growth hormone. So we know it's made and secreted by the anterior pituitary. Hopefully by the name, you have an idea of what it does. It's going to target body organs, body tissues, especially skeletal muscle, bones, cartilage. It is also going to target the liver. Okay. It's going to cause growth of tissue. If we're going to have growth of tissue, we're going to need glucose in the blood to feed all these cells that all of a sudden are going to begin to divide at a rapid rate. So you should expect growth hormone to cause an increase in blood glucose. I mentioned that you should start making a list of the hormones increase blood pressure. We should do the same thing with blood glucose. Make a list of hormones that increase blood glucose. So growth hormone will do that. Other effects are going to be the release of lipids, so lipolysis, and it will trigger the body to use lipids as a source of energy. Now, this is the other effect, which is actually probably the most important effect, even though I don't have it in red. It is a very, very important effect. It triggers the liver into secreting a series of hormones called insulin-like growth factors, which have exactly the same effect as growth hormone. It stimulates the skeletal muscle, it stimulates bone and cartilage into growing. So when growth hormone is being released, there's actually more than just growth hormone stimulating the growth of muscle and bone and cartilage. It is growth hormone plus the liver hormones, insulin-like growth factors. Okay, but the main thing you need to remember about growth hormone is that it triggers the growth of muscle, bone, cartilage. It makes the liver secrete its own growth hormones and increases blood glucose levels. So this is the effect of insulin-like growth factors, which are also called somatostatin. So it stimulates bone growth, cartilage growth, stimulates protein synthesis in skeletal muscle, so it will also grow. So the effect is essentially the same as those of the growth hormone. Now, growth hormone secretion is controlled by the releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. So growth hormone releasing hormone will trigger the release of growth hormone. The inhibition of growth hormone will take place by the growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So these are hormones that control growth hormone. Other factors that could affect the release of growth hormone would be low blood glucose levels. When we have a lot of amino acids in the blood, meaning we have broken down proteins, so the body can use those proteins to build muscle, for example. On the other hand, rising blood glucose levels are going to inhibit growth hormone. Okay. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. Sorry about that. All right. Okay, so this is just showing you how growth hormone is stimulated, its secretion is stimulated by growth hormone releasing hormone. Okay, give me just a second. Yeah, it's saying low blood glucose and other stressors stimulate secretion of growth hormone releasing hormone, and growth hormone releasing hormone is going to travel to the pituitary, anterior pituitary, and trigger the secretion of growth hormone. These are the effects on target tissue: increased protein synthesis, increased tissue growth. We talked about these: increased glucose in blood, and then once the levels of growth hormone and the effects begin, then it will trigger the hypothalamus into secreting growth hormone inhibiting hormones, and the release of growth hormone will stop. Okay, now the two or the conditions, abnormal conditions of growth hormone, it depends on when the condition takes place. High levels of growth hormone before puberty causes gigantism, which means excessive growth. Low levels causes pituitary dwarfism. So this is low levels, and gigantism are high levels. After puberty, once growth has ceased, high levels cause a condition called acromegaly, in which there's growth of hands, feet, the facial features enlarge, the face enlarges. Decrease of growth hormone as we age is normal. Okay, so we have high levels of growth hormone when we're children, and especially very high levels at puberty. And then the levels begin to drop significantly after puberty. Okay, prolactin, not going to spend much time on this one. Essentially what it does is triggers the production of milk in females. It does have some function in males around sexual function, and is regulated by hypothalamic hormones. Prolactin releasing hormone causes the release of prolactin. Prolactin inhibitory hormone stops the release. Okay, so let me move on and let's go to TSH. TSH stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. This is a tropic hormone, so it's going to turn on, and in this case, it's going to turn on the cells in the thyroid that secrete thyroid hormones. The cells are called follicular cells. So if you've seen the thyroid, if you've studied the thyroid, remember there are two populations of cells in the thyroid that release hormones, C cells and follicular cells. TSH only affects follicular cells. It does not affect C cells. Okay, so the effect will be, as expected, secretion of thyroid hormones. Okay, so what regulates secretion of TSH is going to be TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone, which is a hypothalamic hormone. What's going to stop secretion of TSH is going to be high levels of T3 and T4. So this will be an inhibitory negative feedback mechanisms. So once TSH has done its job, which is cause the release of T3 and T4, high levels of T3 and T4 are going to come back and trigger or inhibit secretion of TRH and TSH, so that now the stimulation of the thyroid will cease. Similarly, ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, its target is the adrenal cortex. The effects will be increased secretion of adrenal cortex hormones, especially cortisol. There's 3 sets of hormones secreted in the adrenal cortex. The one that is more sensitive to ACTH is cortisol. So regulation is going to be again through hypothalamic hormones, CRH, corticotropic releasing hormone, will stimulate release of ACTH. Once ACTH has done its job, of corticotropic hormones like cortisol, high levels of cortisol are going to inhibit ACTH. So this is similar to the way TSH is being controlled. Okay. Lastly, for these tropic hormones, the gonadotropics, we're going to talk more about them at the end of the semester. So this is just an introduction. LH, luteinizing hormone, and follicle stimulating hormones are going to trigger or turn on the testes and the ovaries, which in turn are going to secrete estrogen and progesterone. So the effects are going to be secretion of sex hormones by gonads, testes and ovaries. Sex hormones are estrogen, progesterone, testosterone. LH also causes ovulation. FSH causes the production of a sperm and the ovum, but we'll worry about that when we look at the reproductive system. Gonadotropic hormones are again controlled by hypothalamic hormone. Gonadotropic releasing hormone is going to cause the release of FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary, and high levels of estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone are going to shut down LH and FSH release. Okay, so that takes care of the anterior pituitary, the adrenal hypothesis. So we move on to the thyroid. Notice the location below the voice box right here. This is a 2-lobed gland connected by an isthmus. Okay, and the let me just show you the picture better yet than that words right here. The tissue is made by 2 things. It's made by what we call follicles. So this entire structure here is a follicle. I'm going to change the color. Maybe to a black one, maybe more visible. So this is called a follicle. And then in between, there's another follicle here. Here's another follicle. In between follicles, there's this population of cells right here. They're called the C cells. C cells or parafollicular cells. Sorry, yeah, parafollicular cells or C cells. So we have 2 structures or 2 populations of cells. We have the cells that make the follicle and these little clusters of cells between follicles, which are called parafollicular cells. The follicle is made of cells which are called follicular cells. So don't let these follicle confuse you. The follicle itself is this structure. The follicular cells are the cells of the follicle. And those are going to be these little cells here. They're actually simple cuboidal cells right there. So those are follicular cells. So we have two populations of cells, follicular cells and parafollicular cells. So that tells you there are two kinds of hormones being secreted by the thyroid. The follicular cells are going to secrete thyroid hormones. The parafollicular cells will secrete calcitonin, which is a hormone that is involved in calcium metabolism. Now, the follicle, these little follicular cells are positioned around these lake-looking substance, which is called a colloid. So this is a colloid, which is a substance that stores thyroid hormones. The reason why thyroid hormones have to be stored in this manner is because we need iodine to make thyroid hormone. And iodine is a fairly rare element. So when the body gets a hold of it, it keeps it, it stores it, so that it always has available a storage stash of iodine to be able to continuously make thyroid hormone. So thyroid hormone requires iodine. It's made from a amino acid called tyrosine that has been modified, and iodine has been attached to it. There's two forms of hormone, T3, which has 3 iodine atoms attached to it. It's also called triiodothyronine, and thyroxine, which has 4 iodine atoms attached to it. The thyroid gland secretes a lot more T4 than T3. However, T3 is the actual active hormone. So once the hormone reaches its target tissue, T4 has to be converted into T3. So iodine is required for thyroid hormone synthesis. It is a rare element found in just some foods like seafoods, and so that's why the body has to store it. Target, pretty much every single organ in the body is a target for thyroid hormone. This PowerPoint kind of shows you a little bit of how this is happening. So what will be taking place is, you can see here iodine being transported into the cell. This little cell right here is a follicular cell. So that's a follicular cell. This is the colloid in here. So iodine is transported. The iodine is bound to a protein. So now we have an iodinated thyroglobulin, and this iodinated thyroglobulin is stored into the colloid. When the cell, the follicular cell, needs to make T3 and T4, it will retrieve this thyroglobulin back into the cell, where it will be broken down and reassembled in T3 and T4, which will be secreted into the blood. So this is just showing you how the iodine is stored for later use as the cells make T3 and T4. Okay, now this is a very unique hormone. Chapter 17, the few PowerPoints that we had for Chapter 17, put this hormone as a lipid-soluble hormone. And what that means is that it can cross the lipid cell membrane and go inside the cell and begin to affect the mitochondrial DNA. So it goes inside the mitochondria and begins to affect the mitochondrial DNA, also affects the nuclear DNA. So it is one of the few hormones that actually travels into the interior of the cell. Most hormones remain on the outside of the cell, bound to receptors. Thyroid hormone has such a profound effect that goes inside the cells. What they're going to do is they're going to increase the metabolism of cells. So they're going to wrap up the mitochondria into making more ATP. If the cell's metabolism increases, the cell begins to burn more calories. So that's what we call a calorigenic effect. If the cell is burning more calories and making more ATP, in the process of making ATP, heat escapes. So our temperature may go up. We have more heat production. Okay, so heat production will be one of the effects of thyroid hormones. Thyroid hormone is very, very important during childhood because it has a permissive effect on growth hormone. We need thyroid hormone for growth hormone to work properly, which makes sense if you think about it. If you have a hormone that is going to make skeletal muscle, bones, cartilage grow, we better have also the thyroid hormone that increases the metabolism of those tissues. This is another very important function. It's needed for the maturation of the nervous system. As a matter of fact, a lack of thyroid hormone during when a baby is born might lead to mental retardation. So that's how important it is for the maturation of the nervous system. Okay, so those are the important effects of thyroid hormone. So obviously, anything that important will be tightly regulated. Thyroid hormone is secreted in response to TSH release, the thyroid stimulating hormone. And what TSH is going to do is going to stimulate the thyroid gland, not only into secreting T3 and T4, but it also stimulates it into growing and becoming larger. That's why too much TSH will cause an enlarged thyroid. Let's see. TSH in turn is secreted because of TRH. So TRH, thyroid releasing hormone, causes the secretion of TSH. TSH causes the secretion of T3 and T4. Other conditions that triggers the secretion of thyroid hormones is when we're cold, because the hormone will increase metabolism and increase body temperature. So that's another instance in which we secrete T3 and T4. So being stressed, being cold, causes secretion of TSH by the anterior pituitary, which causes secretion of T3 and T4. Inhibition is negative feedback. High levels of T3 and T4 come back and shut down TRH and TSH, which eventually will cause decrease in T3 and T4. And the whole system continues to work in this manner. So this is showing you hypothermia, so that is cold, and sometimes other stressors causes the release of TRH, which travels to the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system, causes the anterior pituitary into secreting TSH. TSH travels to the blood, reaches the thyroid, and causes the release of T3 and T4. T3 and T4 increases metabolism of cells, increases body temperature, also involving normal growth and development. High levels of T3 and T4 now are going to come back and shut down TSH production, TRH production. So now the thyroid stops being stimulated, levels of T3 and T4 go down, and if they go down low enough, that will trigger the whole process to begin again. Okay, abnormal conditions. We have increased secretion of T3 and T4. It's called hyperthyroidism. This is an autoimmune condition. So this is high T3 and T4. Another name for it is Graves' disease. So what we have in this case is antibodies that are being made that are going to act as TSH. They go to the thyroid, bind to the thyroid, and cause the thyroid to secrete lots of T3 and T4. But notice that what is stimulating the thyroid is not TSH, is these abnormal antibodies. Because T3 and T4 are high, levels of TSH are low, because it's causing the low levels of TSH, and yet T3 and T4 are high, not because of TSH, which is low, but because of the antibodies. Because the thyroid is being stimulated, there's typically goiter. Goiter means an enlarged thyroid. And in this case, the thyroid is enlarged because of the antibodies stimulating it. This is another sign. Exophthalmos means an increase in connective tissue behind eyeballs, which push the eyeballs out. And exophthalmos means these protruding eyeballs, which is typical of Graves' disease. This is goiter, an enlarged thyroid, which is very dramatic in that picture. So that was hyperthyroidism. Hypothyroidism is the opposite. It's low levels of T3 and T4. This may be caused by a tumor, for example, of the thyroid. Lack of iodine in the diet will cause it also. And what happens is, if we have low T3 and T4, so we have low T3 and T4, now we have high levels of TSH because T3 and T4 are not present to bring it down. So high levels of TSH go to the thyroid and try to stimulate it into secreting more T3 and T4. And at the same time, it causes the thyroid to grow, causes goiter. Okay. So if the condition is caused by pituitary insufficiency, that will mean low TSH, then that is different from, that's another cause of hypothyroidism. And in that case, we will not have high levels of TSH. We would have low levels of TSH. So measuring the levels of TSH is important to know what kind of hypothyroidism is present. However, the signs and symptoms are the same. Now, signs and symptoms of hyper versus hypothyroidism. Hyperthyroidism, you have a high metabolic rate. Hypo, you're going to have a decreased metabolic rate. Hyperthyroidism, because of the high metabolic rate, you're going to have weight loss, increased appetite. Your heart rate may be fast. On the other hand, hypothyroidism, you're going to have weight gained, reduced appetite. You're going to be cold. Your heart rate will be low. Okay, so these are some of the signs and symptoms. You can take a look at them, and hopefully they make sense as you think about the function of the hormone. Okay. All right. Let's see. So that takes care of the thyroid hormones, which are secreted by the follicular cells of the thyroid gland. The other hormone secreted by the thyroid gland, which is secreted by the parafollicular cells, also called C cells, is calcitonin. Calcitonin is involved in blood calcium metabolism. Specifically, what it does is it lowers blood calcium. And we should have seen this hormone last semester under the bone skeletal system chapter. So what the hormone does is inhibits osteoclasts. If you remember, osteoclasts were the cells that broke down bone. So if these cells are not working, now bone is not being broken down, and osteoblasts are not going to be counteracted. They're going to be the only ones working, making bone. So osteoblasts take calcium from blood and deposit it in bone. So that by removing calcium from blood, osteoblasts are going to decrease blood calcium levels. So the target organs are going to be bones. Decrease osteoclast activity, allowing osteoblasts to use blood calcium in bone building. It also affects the kidneys. It triggers the kidneys into keeping calcium from the blood that's being filtered. It affects the intestines by preventing the absorption of calcium from foods. Calcitonin decreases blood calcium. The antagonistic hormone is going to be PTH, parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone is secreted by the parathyroid gland, which is a series of glandular tissues located on the posterior aspect of the thyroid. So the population of cells in the parathyroid gland that secretes PTH are called chief cells. The function of PTH is to increase blood calcium. So calcitonin is going to lower blood calcium, and it will be secreted when blood calcium levels are too high. PTH is going to increase blood calcium and is secreted when blood calcium levels are too low. So the effect is to increase blood calcium levels. It increases the activity of osteoclasts so that osteoclasts break down bone and the bone is secreted into the blood. PTH also stimulates vitamin D production so that the intestines are going to absorb more calcium from foods. PTH also triggers the kidneys into eliminating more calcium, into keeping more calcium from urine so that calcium levels increase. So that's what this PowerPoint is showing. The effects of PTH causes osteoclast activity to secrete calcium into the blood. It causes the intestines or vitamin D secretion, which causes the intestines into absorbing more calcium from food. And finally, through the kidneys into keeping more calcium and secreting it into the blood. All three will have the same effect, increasing blood calcium levels. Okay. Now, next gland, we only have two more to go. Well, actually three. Adrenal cortex, adrenal medulla, and the pancreas. All right, adrenal glands, similar to the pituitary, in that these are two glands, not one. In this case, the inner medulla, the interior tissue, is nervous tissue. The outer tissue, the cortex, is true glandular tissue. Okay, you know that the gland is located on top of the kidneys. Okay, and when it is looked at, there are two distinct areas: the cortex on the outside and the medulla on the inside. Very, very different tissues. Medulla is nervous tissue, and the cortex is glandular tissue. When we look at these tissues under the microscope, this is the adrenal cortex. From here to here is the adrenal cortex. And down here is the adrenal medulla. The adrenal cortex is going to have three distinct populations of cells. At the very top up here, we have a series of cells that make these circular structures. And the area is called the zona glomerulosa. The zona glomerulosa secretes a group of hormones called mineralocorticoids. Okay, ran out of room there. The zona fasciculata is this very wide area in which the cells are making these long cords like that. This is the zona fasciculata, and it secretes a series of hormones called glucocorticoids. Okay. And finally, the last zone is this one right here at the bottom, the deepest zone. And in this case, it should be looking like a net. It's called the zona reticularis, and reticularis means net. This area secretes androgens. These three populations of hormones are made from cholesterol. So these are cholesterol-based hormones. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Cholesterol. Okay, that should be an R. Cholesterol. All right. Because they're made from cholesterol and they are secreted by the adrenal cortex, they are corticosteroids. So steroids. So this group of hormones made by cholesterol in the adrenal cortex, corticosteroids, are called steroids. All right, the important thing about these two, from chapter 17, these are cholesterol hormones, which means they're lipid soluble. All of these hormones go inside the cell. Lipid soluble means they can't they can dissolve into the cell membrane and find their way inside the cell, even further, find their way across the nuclear envelope and arrive at the nucleus and begin to mess with the DNA. So they have a very, very profound effect on DNA. Okay, and actually, I think we're going to talk about the medulla first. So we'll come back to the cortex in just a second. The adrenal medulla is very, very important. We're going to talk about it all semester long. It secretes two groups of hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine the acronym is E, norepinephrine, the acronym is NE. Remember that norepinephrine is also used as a neurotransmitter by some neurons. So NE, norepinephrine, is a neurotransmitter and a hormone. Okay, together they're called catecholamines because of the chemical makeup. These are hormones of the sympathetic nervous system. So what's going to happen is when the sympathetic nervous system stimulates the adrenal medulla, so the neurons of the sympathetic nervous system stimulate the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla, in response, are going to secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. So these hormones are going to have the same effect in the body as the sympathetic nervous system has in the body. So now you can review back from last semester all the effects of the sympathetic nervous system, and those will be the same effects of these hormones. The target organs are pretty much all over the body, so pretty much almost all the organs in the body are targets, and these hormones bind to alpha and beta adrenergic receptors. Let's see. Okay, the effect. All right, epinephrine, which is also called adrenaline, is going to cause glucose release by the liver, which was one effect of the sympathetic nervous system. Remember, the sympathetic nervous system is the flight or fight response. So these hormones are going to trigger a flight or fight response. If you're running from a bear, you want glucose being secreted into your blood because you want as much energy as possible. Epinephrine is going to cause the breakdown of stored glucose by the liver and the release and by the skeletal muscle. It's going to cause a fat tissue breakdown. Again, we want tons of energy being released into the blood. This is important. Dilation of blood vessels in cardiac and skeletal muscle. You want these blood vessels dilated because we are going to run. This is a stress response. So we need to oxygenate the heart and skeletal muscles. Other effects, in this case of both epinephrine and norepinephrine, they increase the heart rate, and they do more increase heart rate. They increase the force of contraction. So that's important because unless you do both, you're not going to pump more blood. If you only increase the heart rate, you're not going to be pumping more blood out. You're just going to beat faster. Both have to happen. Increase heart rate, increase contraction of the heart. And this is very, 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 very important right here. We're going to talk about these all semester long. This is what's going to happen. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are going to constrict the blood vessels of what we call peripheral organs. These are, if you will, not important organs. If you're being chased by a bear, the skin is not important. So those blood vessels are going to be constricted. The kidneys are not important. If you're being chased by a bear, you don't want to stop and take a leak. Digesting food is not important if you are under tremendous stress. So the blood vessels in these organs, reproductive organs will be another one, are constricted. And now the blood is being moved to the important organs. Remember, the ones that are going to dilate: heart, skeletal muscle, also the brain will be in that list. Okay. So we are diverting blood from the non-important organs by constricting the vessels, and that blood will be shunted into the important ones that are going to keep us alive under stress. So this is a very important response. Because we're moving all the blood to a smaller place in the body, blood pressure in the center of the body, which is where we measure blood pressure, is going to increase. So we're going to increase blood pressure when we do this. Okay. So when do we secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine? You probably already know that. Under stress. Sympathetic nervous system is stimulated under stress. Physical activity. So nowadays we're not chased by bears, but we do go out and run marathons, for example. Low blood pressure. That's another instance when we're going to secrete this hormone because we're going to increase blood, not only by diverting blood, but also because we're going to increase heart rate and force of contraction. This is going to increase blood pressure. Remember, make a list of the hormones that increase blood pressure. First in the list was ADH. ADH increased blood pressure by increasing blood volume. So high blood volume equal high blood pressure. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are going to increase blood pressure by a different means. It's going to increase heart rate, increase the force of contraction, shunt blood towards the heart. So essentially, more blood in the heart, and that's going to cause a high blood pressure. Okay. Let's see. This is showing you stressors. Stressors like stress, physical activity. This is another stressor right here, low blood glucose levels. That's a huge stressor. That's going to cause the body into secreting epinephrine and norepinephrine. So actually it's going to activate the sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system goes out and stimulates the adrenal medulla into secreting epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay. All right. So go back. Epinephrine and norepinephrine will cause an increase in blood glucose. So we had the list of hormones that increase blood pressure, and those were ADH so far, epinephrine and norepinephrine. We had the list of hormones that increased blood glucose, and those were epinephrine, norepinephrine, growth hormone. Okay. Let's see. Okay, it's being released right here. Let me go for this one. Okay, so this is just going to go through some of the functions or the effects. So increase of glucose and fatty acids, increase heart rate and contractility, increase metabolic rate of the skeletal muscles, more active, more blood also to those muscles, to the skeletal muscles, increase blood flow to the heart and skeletal muscle, decrease blood flow through most organs, peripheral organs, skin, GI tract, kidneys. Okay, so under those parameters, when you think about it, if someone is in shock, low blood pressure, that's going to stimulate the sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic stimulation is going to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. And that person is going to be pale because there will be no blood on the skin. Their kidneys are shutting down because epinephrine and norepinephrine are stopping blood flow to the kidneys. Going back to the special senses chapter, pupils under sympathetic control, dilated. So the pupils of that person will be dilated. Their heart rate will be up. The force of contraction will be up in an effort to increase blood pressure. So those will be the conditions that somebody in shock will present. Somebody who is under sympathetic stimulation because they're under shock. All right. Okay, let's see. Adrenal cortex. The adrenal cortex, so we finished the adrenal medulla. The adrenal cortex is the one that has several layers, and each layer secretes a different hormone. These are lipid hormones. They're all derived from cholesterol. All of them bind DNA. They're very, very powerful hormones. So they directly affect DNA, affecting protein synthesis. We have three populations, mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and androgens. do know that the zona glomerulosa secretes mineralocorticoids, zona fasciculara secretes glucocorticoids, zona reticularis secretes androgens. Okay, give me a second. What did I do there? Okay, yeah. We're going to start with mineralocorticoids. Notice how there are tons of little asterisks here. This is one of the most important hormones we're going to see all semester. Aldosterone and ADH. We're going to repeat those constantly, almost at every chapter. Aldosterone is the most important mineralocorticoid. The effect of aldosterone is the target organ is the kidneys, and it is going to cause the kidneys into keeping sodium. So now sodium is going to be kept and put back into the blood. So we're going to increase sodium levels in the blood, while at the same time decreasing or losing potassium. So we're going to stop the reabsorption of potassium, increase reabsorption of sodium. So now we're going to lose potassium, which is going to decrease blood potassium. So the effect of aldosterone is to increase blood sodium, decrease blood potassium. What makes this hormone so important is that if we increase blood sodium, wherever sodium goes, water follows. So if water follows sodium into blood, so now the kidneys are taking water and sodium and releasing those back into the blood, which this causes an increase in blood volume. If we increase blood volume, we increase blood pressure. And that's the reason why this is such an important hormone, is because it increases blood pressure. So when are we going to secrete this hormone? We're going to secrete this hormone when we need to increase blood pressure, right there. Blood pressure. Low blood pressure increases aldosterone secretion because an increase in sodium retention or reabsorption causes water to follow. Wherever sodium goes, water follows. Water follows to the blood, so we increase blood volume, and that increases blood pressure. So let's go back to the hormones that increase blood pressure. Hormones that can increase blood pressure, ADH, because it keeps water, high blood pressure. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, and now we add aldosterone to the list. Epinephrine and norepinephrine increase heart rate and contractility. Aldosterone keeps sodium, water follows sodium, so high blood volume, high blood pressure. ADH keeps water, so high blood volume, high blood pressure. Okay. Other conditions that causes us to secrete aldosterone will be if we have too much blood potassium, because aldosterone makes us lose potassium. So high blood, it's called hyperkalemia. Kalium means potassium. So hyperkalemia, too high potassium in the blood, we secrete aldosterone. Aldosterone triggers the kidneys into excreting potassium in the urine, and that results in lower levels of potassium in the blood. By the same token, if we have low sodium in the blood, that will trigger the adrenal cortex into secreting aldosterone. Aldosterone increases sodium retention, which will increase sodium in the blood. So hopefully this makes sense. If you remember that aldosterone keeps sodium, loses potassium. Okay. All right, now glucocorticoids. The main glucocorticoid is cortisol. The name glucose should tell you what this hormone does. It's going to increase blood glucose. And this is the story of cortisol. Cortisol is, okay, give me just a second. Cortisol is a stress hormone. And the stress in this case is low blood glucose. The body is supposed to secrete cortisol only under stressful conditions when blood glucose is very low, and the secretion should be short and has the goal to just increase blood glucose. Let me give you an example. In the morning, you've been fasting all day, all night as you've been asleep. The blood levels of glucose are incredibly low at that point. The alarm goes off, all of a sudden you wake up. The reason why you wake up and are able to jump out of bed, even though your blood glucose levels are very low because you have not eaten for the past 8 or 10 hours if you're lucky, you slept for a long time. The reason why you're able to get up is because the body gives you a shot of cortisol in order to get you going. You have very low blood glucose levels. You need to get going. You wake up, the body shuts cortisol through your blood, and cortisol immediately begins to trigger the liver into not only secreting, but at that point you may not even have a storage of glucose anymore. It's going to trigger the liver into making glucose from scratch. It's called gluconeogenesis. So cortisol is going to get the liver to get you glucose, doesn't matter how, but it's got to get you glucose in the blood. So it triggers the liver into giving you glucose. It's going to break up adipose tissue. You need energy and make all those lipids go out into the blood. And obviously it's going to stimulate a skeleton breaking out its own glycogen to produce its own glucose to keep itself going. So the purpose of cortisol is to get you going. Under stress, you're going to get a shot of cortisol, meaning a shot of high glucose, high lipids. Your muscles are going to get all of a sudden a lot of glucose, and your body begins to get going. This is a stress hormone. It is meant to be secreted for a short period of time, just to accomplish its goal. That's it. And then the levels should get down. You need to eat breakfast, and now the blood levels of glucose will go up again, and everything is good. And cortisol immediately disappears. The reason why it should never stay in the blood is because cortisol depresses the immune system.